Good afternoon. My name is Kassi Grunder, and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about my research on the human rights abuses perpetrated against Alaska Natives and about the applicability of transitional justice mechanisms in cases such as these. But before I dig into the more technical stuff, I want to share with you a quote and a story. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I ask that you bring that quote with you as I tell you the story. So, beginning with first Western contact, Native Alaskans have been getting the short end of the stick, so to speak, like a lot of other indigenous cultures around the world. But our story today starts in the 1930s, when in order to apply U.S. educational policy to Alaska, a handful of boarding schools were established across the state. Boarding schools such as these were established about 50 years earlier in the rest of the United States and in Canada, with the purpose of forcibly acculturating Native children and doing away with Native culture entirely. Or, as the founder of the first boarding school said, kill the Indian, save the man. So, beginning in the 1930s, children from across the state of Alaska were sent to schools that were sometimes thousands of miles away. Parents who didn't want to send their children risked arrest. And children as young as 5 years old were sent to these schools. When they got there, they were surrounded by people that they'd never met before. They were taken away from everything that they'd ever known. And they were surrounded by people who were speaking a language that they'd likely never even heard. They were treated really horribly and kept in awful conditions. And they were issued a number. And for some children, that was what they would be known as for the entirety of their educational experience. They were taught that everything from their culture, their language, what their parents taught them, all of that was wrong and bad. They were also subjected to physical abuse. This quote is from Alaska Native scholar Jim LaBelle, and it illustrates some of the abuses that were common in the boarding schools. This experience happened when he was in elementary school. I'll read you the quote. "I saw a grown man beat a 12-year-old boy into unconsciousness. It will be forever seared into my memory. The force of the man's fist against the young boy's jaw splayed the boy's mouth open to his ear. His cheek just fell open. He quickly blacked out from the force of the blow. Blood gushed out everywhere, his jaw broken in a number of places. The sight of this young boy with his mouth wired shut was a constant and daily reminder of that violent scene." In addition to the physical and psychological harms, sexual abuse was endemic. Teachers and school staff would come into the dormitories at night and abuse children. Children who weren't direct victims of this were witness to these events. Many children began offending as well. Not only was this behavior prevalent, but nothing was done to stop it. There was no punishment for those responsible. These schools were also falling short of their obligation to educate students. While there's a federal mandate to provide education to all students, this didn't mean equal education. And prior to the mid-1970s, most Native students only received education through 8th grade. Beginning in the 1970s, though, there were a couple of educational experiments that were applied in Alaska, but those were failures as well. A 1973 study showed that one regional high school was failing 96% of incoming freshmen from villages. 1976, though, saw the establishment of village schools in all of the villages that had more than a handful of eligible students. So that was effectively the end of this era of boarding schools, although boarding schools still exist in Alaska. There's so much more to say about this, though. This trauma and others has left lasting generational and cultural harms on Native Alaskans. In a study conducted in Canada to examine the impacts of very similar history there, the authors found that these layers of historical trauma impacted public health outcomes as well. People who'd attended boarding schools or were the descendants of people who'd attended these schools were substantially more likely to be victimized in their lifetime, as well as had a higher prevalence of suicidal thoughts or attempts. This holds true in Alaska as well. In Alaska, Native people commit suicide at an alarming rate. Native women are disproportionately victims of sexual abuse, and we are still failing Native children in education. So what can we do about all of this? I want to bring you back to this quote. There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. This history that I've shared with you has been cloaked in shame and pain. And the stories of these people who've survived this have gone largely untold. There's a clear need for justice in this case that has as yet gone unmet. So, let's explore one option, transitional justice. This is where we get into the more technical stuff. Are you ready? Okay. Transitional justice refers to the set of judicial and non-judicial measures that have been implemented by different countries in order to redress the legacies of massive human rights abuses. These measures include criminal prosecutions, truth commissions, reparation programs, and various kinds of institutional reform. You on board? Great. So while I'm defining things, I'll also define the term consolidated democracy. I'll use that later. A consolidated democracy is simply a mature democracy that's also stable. So think of the United States, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom. So transitional justice emerged out of what's called the third wave of democratic transitions that happened in the late 20th century. Maybe some of you remember this. Think of Argentina, Chile, the Philippines, South Korea. Many of the countries that went through democratic transitions during that time had a lot of human rights abuses in their recent past. And so there was some kind of accounting that needed to happen for them to be able to move forward into democracy. That's where transitional justice came from. Increasingly, though, transitional justice has been used in consolidated democracies to address harms such as the ones that I've talked to you about today. Most notably, it's been used in Australia, Greensboro, North Carolina, and Canada. In Australia, it was used to address the human rights violations perpetrated against Aboriginal children. These children were taken from their families just for the fact that they were Aboriginal and placed with white families so they could be acculturated. In Greensboro, North Carolina, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the harms that happened out of the 1979 Greensboro massacre, in which 5 people were killed. All of the people who perpetrated that crime were acquitted, and there were a lot of lasting tensions in the community. Something that's interesting about the Greensboro case is that it was conducted almost entirely by civil society and had very little governmental contribution to it. Canada is also wrapping up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission right now. They wrap up in 2014. This case is of particular importance today because of the harms that they're addressing are really similar to the harms that happened in Alaska. They're dealing with their legacy of residential schools, of sending Indigenous children. When Canada first began their inquiry into these abuses, they found that the abuses were much more dramatic than they had previously assumed. They found out about organized rings of pedophiles that preyed on children in the schools. They found out about children being murdered and buried on school grounds. They found out about that victims were subjected to medical experimentation and forced sterilization. The last of these schools closed in 1996. So what are we waiting for? Let's have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Let's figure out some reparations and institutional reform. You ready? There's a lot of critics of using transitional justice in consolidated democracies, though. First of all, transitional justice was developed to take advantage of the unique and generative space that really only occurs during major shifts in the political landscape. In consolidated democracies, there's no such transition. And so the opportunities for structural change are really much more limited. Additionally, there's a concern that applying the label of transitional justice to cases in which transition is absent can negatively impact the reputation of transitional justice. Transitional justice that occurs in these cases, where the change that can come out of it is limited by the will of an oppressive government, it's judged by through the same lens as transitional justice projects in truly transitional contexts, potentially marring the reputation and diminishing the overall utility of transitional justice. Despite these valid criticisms, though, there exists unmet justice needs for which the transitional justice toolkit is a really good match. So rather than restrict the scope of transitional justice, we should maybe just be more mindful about how we assess its successes and failures. Transitional justice is not a solid and fixed thing, and it's likely that over time we'll see the emergence of a new justice paradigm that is specifically tailored to address the painful legacies that exist in countries such as this one. But in the meantime, transitional justice has the tools to address some of the harms, such as the ones that have been perpetrated against Native Alaskans. And it is time that their stories are told. And it is time that they have access to justice. Thank you.